On the morning of March 7, 1943, above the rail yards near Smolensk, a Bell P-39 Airacobra, marked with Soviet red stars, sliced through thin clouds at 4,000 feet. Senior Lieutenant Aleksandr Pokryshkin advanced the throttle of his Allison V-1710 engine and felt the familiar nose-heavy surge of acceleration. Below, a German supply train stood stranded on the tracks, its locomotive hissing steam into the freezing air as crewmen scrambled to clear ice from the jammed switch that had trapped them in the open. Pokryshkin had flown American fighters before, the P-40 Warhawk with its shark-toothed grin, and the broad-bellied P-47 Thunderbolt the Soviets nicknamed Samovar. But the Airacobra felt unlike any of them. Its mid-mounted engine, tucked behind the cockpit, gave it a strange balance, agile yet unpredictable, prone to sudden flat spins if handled carelessly at low speeds. American pilots had dismissed it for high-altitude combat, where its unsupercharged Allison engine gasped for power above 15,000 feet. But Pokryshkin was not at 15,000 feet. He was diving on a stationary locomotive. In his sights sat a weapon the Soviets had come to revere, the 37mm LM-4 cannon firing through the propeller hub. German intelligence would later puzzle over the same question for months. How had an aircraft the Luftwaffe mocked as outdated become one of the most feared ground attack fighters on the Eastern Front? That 37mm cannon was the heaviest armament ever standard on a single-engine American fighter. Each shell weighed roughly 1.5 pounds, enough to smash armor, wreck bridges, and, as German train crews would learn, rip through a steam locomotive's heart. Though the M4 fired slowly, about 150 rounds per minute, its impact was catastrophic. Pokryshkin lined up his shot, the locomotive growing in his gun sight. Below, the train crew abandoned their tools and fled toward the trees, black shapes scattering across the snow. He pressed the trigger. The cannon thumped, a deep, percussive rhythm that shook the airframe. The first round punched into the boiler near the firebox. 2 more followed in half-second bursts, walking up the engine's flank. A moment later, the boiler erupted, steam and shrapnel bursting outward as rivets tore loose under 300 pounds per square inch of pressure. The locomotive disintegrated in a cloud of vapor and twisted iron, pulling up hard through the rising plume. Pokryshkin banked to survey the ruin. The supply cars behind the wreck sat unscathed yet immobilized, 60 kilometers behind German lines, doomed to be swallowed by the spring Rasputitsa, the season of mud. This was not the air war the Luftwaffe had imagined. The Bell P-39 Airacobra had entered U.S. service in 1941 to great fanfare among its designers, but unease among pilots. Bell engineers had gambled on an unconventional layout. The engine mounted. Behind the pilot, linked to the propeller by a long drive shaft beneath the cockpit floor. This freed the nose for the 37mm cannon, giving it perfect aim and eliminating the convergence problems of wing-mounted guns. On paper, the design promised a nimble, well-balanced fighter. Early wind tunnel results seemed to confirm it. Excellent, handling at low altitudes and devastating forward firepower. But reality intruded. Without a turbo supercharger, the Allison engine lost power above 12,000 feet. By 15,000 feet, the arena of most Western Front air battles, the P-39 became sluggish prey for German interceptors. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 outclimbed and outfought it easily. Yet on the Eastern Front, where battles raged low over forests, rivers and frozen roads, the Airacobra's flaws became its virtues, and its cannon turned it into the scourge of German armor and locomotives alike. The Fw-190 retained strong performance above 20,000 feet, letting German pilots choose when and how to fight, striking from altitude with speed in their favor. American test pilots who evaluated the Airacobra for European operations were scathing in their reports. It climbed too slowly to intercept bombers and lost too much speed at height to chase fleeing fighters. Its unusual engine placement made it dangerously prone to flat spins if airspeed dropped too low during turning combat. Recovery from such spins was difficult and often impossible. Several test pilots were killed when the aircraft entered unrecoverable modes. Its side-opening car door entry, convenient on the ground, proved hazardous in emergencies. A pilot had to jettison the door entirely before bailing out, precious seconds lost while possibly spinning, burning, or both. British Royal Air Force crews, who received early production Airacobras through Lend-Lease, flew one operational sortie before dismissing it as unfit for European combat and assigning it to training duties far from the front. By mid-1942, U.S. fighter groups bound for Europe were re-equipped with P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs instead. The Airacobra had been tested, judged, and found lacking for the high-altitude war over Western Europe. Production continued mainly because it performed adequately elsewhere, where altitude mattered less, and because American factories needed time to transition to newer types. Luftwaffe intelligence officers reviewing Allied aircraft data noted the Airacobra's figures with interest but no alarm. Here was a fighter that couldn't contest skies above 15,000 feet, couldn't escort bombers, couldn't outrun or outclimb German interceptors, and handled so precariously it endangered its own pilots. Reports circulated through Luftwaffe units portraying the P-39 as typical of American design, acceptable for colonial policing or ground support in lesser theaters, but hopelessly outclassed by Europe's hardened combat machines. German pilots who met the few P-39s in the Mediterranean confirmed it. The Airacobra could be lethal if flown cleverly at low level, using careful energy control, but any German with altitude advantage could disengage at will, leaving the slower American fighter powerless to pursue. This comfortable sense of superiority persisted until Soviet pilots began revealing what the aircraft could do when used to its actual strengths, rather than forced into roles for which it was unsuited. The first Bell P-39 Airacobras reached the USSR in late 1941 and early 1942 via the treacherous Lend-Lease convoys running through the Arctic waters north of Norway to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. These routes were deadly. German U-boats surface. Raiders and bombers sank dozens of Allied ships carrying tanks, trucks, munitions, and aircraft to the Eastern Front. When Soviet pilots and mechanics received their first Airacobras, they studied them with cautious curiosity. The design was utterly foreign. Soviet fighters like the Yakovlev Yak-1 and Yak-7 used straightforward nose-mounted engines and rugged construction suited to field repair. The Lavochkin Lay-5's massive radial could take hits and keep running. The Airacobra looked delicate and complex. Its mid-engine layout, long drive shaft, and English-labeled gauges demanded translation and adjustment. Maintenance crews struggled with its specialized systems and the shortage of proper tools, manuals, and spare parts. American machines required different fasteners, fuels, and procedures altogether. Soviet technicians, used to sturdy simplicity, now faced reduction gearboxes, oxygen systems, and radio equipment far beyond local standards. Yet one feature drew universal attention: its armament. Soviet fighters carried 20mm cannon and 12.7mm machine guns. Effective, yes, but none matched the raw, bone-cracking power of the American weapon mounted in the Airacobra's nose. The 37mm cannon, mounted in the P-39's nose, immediately captured the attention of Soviet armament specialists who understood it was unlike any conventional fighter weapon. Its shells could obliterate targets that shrugged off machine gun and light cannon fire, armored vehicles, bunkers, locomotives, and even the newer German tanks with their steadily thickening armor. Yet the reason this weapon would shine lay not in its design alone, but in how it fit Soviet doctrine. Western air forces focused on high-altitude missions, bomber escort, strategic strikes, and duels for air superiority. The Soviets, shaped by the brutal demands of ground war, fought differently. Their air power existed to smash enemy supply lines, artillery, and troop concentrations. Low altitude, fast, and savage, the Eastern Front Air War unfolded mostly below 10,000 feet, where Soviet and German aircraft clashed directly above the battlefield. German dive bombers and attack planes pummeled Soviet lines, while Soviet formations retaliated in kind. This was not the measured high-altitude sparring of Western Europe, but a vicious, close-range brawl fought from muddy airstrips a few kilometers behind the front. In this environment, the Airacobra's weaknesses at altitude ceased to matter, while its strengths, its 37mm cannon, strong low-altitude performance, decent speed under 10,000 feet, and excellent cockpit visibility made it deadly. Soviet pilots quickly realized the Americans had, by accident, built the ideal low-level attack aircraft for their war, a plane perfectly suited for striking at the logistical heart of the German army. Aleksandr Ivanovich Pokryshkin, who had joined the Soviet Air Force in 1934 as a young mechanic, embodied this understanding. His early career spent repairing engines and airframes gave him a deep technical intuition. By 1943, he was a veteran of over 400 combat sorties against both Luftwaffe fighters and German ground targets. He approached the Airacobra not as a showman, but as an engineer, studying its strengths, limitations, and handling quirks to extract maximum performance. The 37mm cannon fascinated him, not as a dogfighting weapon, though it could obliterate an enemy fighter with a single hit, but as a precision tool for dismantling the German war machine. Soviet intelligence had long identified Germany's dependence on rail transport as its Achilles heel. The vastness of the front, primitive roads, and seasonal mud meant everything. Fuel, ammunition, reinforcements moved by train. If the locomotives stopped, the German army starved. No shells, no fuel, no movement. The railway network in occupied territories functioned with astonishing efficiency, despite partisans, weather, and distance. Specialized railway units repaired damage, rebuilt tracks, and maintained depots. Yet locomotives themselves were irreplaceable. German factories could not build enough new ones to meet wartime demands while sustaining deepening operations. Each destroyed engine meant one less supply artery feeding the front. Pokryshkin developed a methodical system for hunting them. He refined his tactics to exploit the Airacobra's strengths while minimizing risk from German defenses. His attacks began from 3,000 to 5,000 feet, high enough to stay clear of most light flak, but low enough to maintain speed and accuracy. German trains often carried flak cars armed with 20mm to 30mm guns, deadly to any pilot reckless enough to dive straight in. Pokryshkin's solution was precision and momentum. He attacked in a steep dive, letting gravity add to his speed, so anti-aircraft gunners, relying on hand-cranked sights, struggled to track him. His target was always the locomotive's boiler, the steel heart of the machine. A pressurized vessel of superheated water and steam powerful enough to propel hundreds of tons of train and, when ruptured, to tear itself apart in an instant. A single 37mm high explosive round penetrating a locomotive's boiler would produce catastrophic overpressure, ripping seams, destroying the firebox, and rendering the engine irreparable except by full rebuilding at a major facility. A typical attack run lasted under 10 seconds from the moment Pokryshkin opened fire until he pulled away. In that brief window, he fired 8 to a dozen 37mm rounds, walking them along the locomotive's length to strike critical components. The cannon's recoil produced a distinct pulsing through the airframe, each shot nudging the nose off target before stability returned. Experienced pilots learned to compensate and maintain accurate fire through the brief engagement. After wrecking the locomotive, Pokryshkin rarely lingered to hit the cars. The initial strike alerted German flak crews, and follow-up passes against stationary rolling stock invited concentrated defensive fire. His objective was locomotive destruction, not theatrical explosions. One ruined engine meant an immobilized train and a mission accomplished. The stranded cargo could be seized by advancing Soviet forces or finished off later by artillery or follow-up airstrikes under safer conditions. Regiments flying. Airacobras developed locomotive hunting as a systematic, carefully planned operation rather than opportunistic attacks. Intelligence officers kept detailed maps of German rail networks, noting repair yards, major junctions, depots, and the routes most used to feed the front. Partisans behind enemy lines supplied regular reports on train movements, timetables, and security measures, giving commanders the situational picture needed to direct strikes at the highest value targets. Pilots were assigned specific tracks and time windows tailored to intelligence reporting. A regiment might be ordered to disrupt rail traffic across a sector to support an approaching offensive, with individual flights patrolling assigned sections when trains were expected. This method maximized operational effect, ensuring destroyed locomotives produced cascading logistic failures rather than isolated annoyances. The Airacobra's cockpit aided these precision attacks with excellent visibility and effective gun sights. The pilot sat high in the fuselage beneath large glazing that afforded unobstructed forward and lateral views, vital for spotting trains in forests, fields, and village clearings across the Eastern Front. A reflector sight projected a reticle onto a clear panel directly in the pilot's line of sight, permitting accurate aiming without looking down and losing situational awareness. The spring of 1943 was a critical phase on the Eastern Front as Soviet forces readied major offensives to exploit German overreach after Stalingrad. German lines had contracted, but forces remained deep in Soviet territory and utterly reliant on supply lines stretching hundreds of kilometers from railheads in occupied Poland through partisan-infested countryside. Soviet air commanders judged German logistics more vulnerable than frontline formations. Striking tanks, artillery, and infantry head-on invited dense AA defenses and high aircraft losses for limited tactical gain. Hitting supply trains targeted softer assets whose destruction degraded German combat power more profoundly. In March 1943, the 16th Air Army, supporting operations around Smolensk, was ordered to intensify rail interdiction. Intelligence showed German stockpiling for possible spring offensives, with dozens of trains moving munitions, fuel, and reinforcements daily. Commanders wanted that flow broken, so units would be forced to exhaust existing stocks. Pokryshkin's unit, the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, largely equipped with Airacobras, was tasked with a roughly 200-kilometer sector of German-held rail. Their mission was stark and exacting: destroy every locomotive attempting transit through the sector, deny the railways, and force the Germans onto primitive roads that would turn to impassable morasses once the spring Rasputitsa transformed them into rivers of mud. The offensive began on March 5, 1943, with coordinated strikes by multiple Soviet air regiments against German rail targets across a front stretching hundreds of kilometers. The aim was total disruption of German logistics across the central sector, denying the enemy any ability to reroute traffic around damaged tracks. Soviet planners knew rail warfare demanded persistence, not isolated strikes. German railway engineers could patch rails in hours, but replacing destroyed locomotives took weeks or even months. Pokryshkin led the opening raid himself, taking off before dawn from a crude dirt airstrip just 30 kilometers behind. Soviet lines, a patch of flattened earth surrounded by fuel bladders in sandbag revetments and canvas tents for maintenance and crew quarters. No runways, no hangars, just stripped-down functionality designed for quick relocation when the Germans advanced. His flight of 4 Airacobras skimmed the terrain at low altitude to evade radar. Hugging the folds of the land at 300 Messerschmitts, the air was knife-cold despite the approaching spring. frost creeping along the canopy edges where heaters failed to keep up. Pokryshkin watched his instruments closely. The Allison engine demanded careful handling, especially during takeoff and climb, when cylinder head temperatures could spike if power was applied too abruptly. The target appeared precisely where intelligence predicted. A freight train of roughly 40 cars moving south toward German lines, its locomotive trailing a dark plume against the pale dawn sky. The train moved steadily across open farmland, along a raised embankment, perfectly visible from above. No anti-aircraft flashes yet, though Pokryshkin knew flak cars were likely hidden among the wagons. Signaling his wingman, he rolled into a dive from 4,000 feet, maintaining a steep but stable attack angle. The locomotive grew rapidly in his sight. A German BR-52, one of the simplified wartime designs built in great numbers for military hauling, rugged, unsophisticated, and entirely vulnerable to 37mm shells. He fired at 800 meters. The cannon's deep, rhythmic thump filled the cockpit as the tracers arced downward. Tiny course corrections brought his fire onto target. The first round smashed into the tender. The second struck the boiler near the cab. Two more hit dead center. The boiler erupted instantly. Superheated steam and metal fragments blasted outward, engulfing the train in a white cloud. The force derailed several cars behind the engine, sending them sliding off the embankment. Pulling up hard through the vapor, Pokryshkin glanced back to see the locomotive torn open, its machinery scattered across the railbed. His wingman dove next, aiming for a second locomotive coupled at the rear to assist the heavy load, a common German practice on steep grades. That engine exploded just as violently, its boiler ruptured in seconds. The train now lay dead on the tracks, immobilized miles from any repair yard, its supplies stranded and its route rendered impassable. German intelligence at first dismissed the sudden rise in Soviet rail attacks as a minor tactical trend. Trains had always been occasional targets of opportunity, but what emerged in March 1943 was something new, organized, large-scale, and devastatingly effective. Luftwaffe liaison officers attached to German railway units began forwarding increasingly urgent reports from train crews describing Soviet fighters annihilating locomotives with uncanny precision, often in single attack runs. These reports described aircraft diving from medium altitude, striking with remarkable accuracy and destroying entire engines with a handful of shells, leaving nothing but smoking, twisted wreckage unfit even for salvage. The accounts confused German analysts. Soviet fighters were known to use 20mm cannon and heavy machine guns, adequate, against trucks or troops, but never before had they seen aircraft mounting weapons powerful enough to obliterate armored locomotives in mere seconds. Machine guns and 20mm cannons were generally too weak to destroy a locomotive's thick steel boiler or heavy machinery with just a few hits. These engines were built like fortresses, their boilers designed to contain immense internal pressure, often surviving repeated gunfire and limping on in damaged condition. The new Soviet attacks changed that equation entirely. Locomotives weren't merely disabled, they were annihilated. Boilers burst apart, components scattered, and repair crews could do nothing short of a complete rebuild. Soon, German railway lines lay silent, not because tracks were broken, but because there simply weren't enough engines left to haul trains. Tracks could be fixed quickly. Locomotives could not. Rebuilding them required workshops, time, and parts already scarce under the pressures of total war. German anti-aircraft defenses proved equally inadequate. The standard flak cars mounted 20mm and 37mm guns with manual sights, effective against slow, low-flying attackers, but nearly useless against fast-diving aircraft striking from medium altitude. Gunners had mere seconds to acquire and fire, their hand-cranked sights too slow for fleeting targets. Railway authorities begged for more protection, but the Luftwaffe's resources were stretched thin across every front. The same guns and crews were needed to defend cities from Allied bombers, shield frontline troops from Soviet air raids, and guard depots and airfields. There were never enough guns, never enough ammunition, never enough trained men. Fighter cover was ordered for vital trains, but that plan collapsed under reality. German pilots lacked the fuel, aircraft and flight hours to maintain constant patrols over thousands of kilometers of track. Soviet pilots, by contrast, chose when and where to strike, vanishing before German interceptors could even reach the scene. The Luftwaffe was forced into a reactive posture, always too late, always one step behind. Eventually, German intelligence pieced together the source of the devastation. The American-made 37mm cannon mounted on Lend-Lease Bell P-39 Airacobra fighters now flooding into Soviet service. The Luftwaffe's earlier dismissals of the Airacobra as obsolete suddenly looked naive. Intelligence officers had to admit, with visible discomfort, that they had been wrong, not because they misunderstood the aircraft specifications, but because they had judged it by the wrong standards. The P-39 was indeed unsuited to high-altitude duels over Europe, but that wasn't where the Eastern Front was being fought. At low altitudes, where battles raged directly above tanks, trenches and supply lines, the Airacobra was devastating. Its combination of good low-altitude handling and the nose-mounted 37mm cannon made it lethal in Soviet hands. German technical officers who examined captured or crashed Airacobras grudgingly praised its nose gun design, which allowed precise aim without the convergence problems of wing-mounted weapons. Point the aircraft at the target, and the cannon followed. Each 37mm M4 round carried enough explosive to tear open a locomotive boiler, destroy a light tank, or collapse a bunker in one hit. By the summer of 1943, the realization spread through Luftwaffe intelligence circles that the Americans had, inadvertently, built an aircraft tailor-made for Soviet warfare. What Western strategists saw as an underperforming fighter, the Soviets had turned into a precision strike weapon, one that was systematically crippling German logistics more effectively than direct assaults on combat units ever could. German countermeasures, such as moving high-value trains only at night, brought little relief. Soviet pilots adapted effortlessly, finding their prey even in darkness, and the silent wrecks of locomotives along the rails stood as grim evidence of an air war the Germans had never prepared to fight. They adapted by launching dawn and dusk strikes, times when trains were still visible, but the dim light made anti-aircraft fire erratic. German forces tried to station fighters over vital rail sections. Yet Soviet intelligence quickly identified these patrols and shifted their attacks to unguarded routes, leaving German aircraft circling uselessly above empty tracks. Railway engineers toiled around the clock to repair lines and replace lost locomotives, but the pace of Soviet attacks overwhelmed their capacity, plunging German logistics into deeper disarray. By mid-1943, German commanders facing Soviet offensives discovered their armies starved of ammunition, short on fuel, and cut off from reinforcements. The supply trains that sustained the front had been shattered by relentless Soviet air interdiction. German units remained lethal when well supplied, but even elite formations collapsed when their guns fell. Silent for lack of shells, their tanks ran dry, and their wounded could not be evacuated because no trains reached the rear. By summer, Airacobra-equipped Soviet regiments had destroyed hundreds of locomotives across the front, producing a cascading logistical breakdown more crippling than direct battlefield attrition. Aleksandr Pokryshkin himself was credited with dozens of locomotive kills, though Soviet records emphasized aerial victories rather than ground strikes, making exact counts elusive. Still, the effects were unmistakable. The damage became so severe that senior Wehrmacht commanders submitted formal complaints to Berlin over locomotive shortages that paralyzed troop movements. The Germans found themselves fighting a war utterly unlike the one they had prepared for, not sweeping panzer offensives, but a slow, grinding struggle for survival in which logistics mattered more than maneuver. The Eastern Front had turned into a war of supply destruction, with Soviet pilots hunting locomotives as methodically as U-boats once hunted Allied merchant convoys. German industry tried to compensate by ramping up locomotive production, but it faced impossible trade-offs. Every ton of steel diverted to engines meant fewer tanks, fewer trucks, fewer aircraft, and less ammunition. By 1943, the German economy was already stretched to the breaking point, fully mobilized, every factory and worker operating at maximum capacity. There were no reserves left to summon. Each new locomotive built came at the cost of something else desperately needed at the front. The arithmetic of attrition was merciless. Soviet pilots were destroying engines faster than German factories could replace them, while Soviet production, bolstered by Lend-Lease, was expanding in both quantity and efficiency. As 1943 turned to 1944, the cumulative loss of locomotives triggered a full-blown transportation crisis the Reich could not repair through discipline or organization alone. Pokryshkin's own record reflected his precision and discipline in both air-to-air and ground operations. With 59 confirmed aerial victories against the Luftwaffe, he ranked among the Soviet Union's leading aces. Yet his deeper legacy lay in developing a repeatable system of locomotive interdiction, tactics that other Soviet pilots soon adopted, spreading the method across all cannon-armed fighter regiments. The Soviet Air Force formally recognized the Airacobra's value, requesting ever more of them from the United States. While US and British forces retired the P-39 from European combat early, its altitude limits deemed fatal in Western skies, the Soviets embraced it wholeheartedly. Over 4,700 Airacobras were eventually delivered to the USSR, more than half of total US production, making it the single largest fighter type transferred under Lend-Lease. Soviet pilots prized it for qualities uniquely suited to their conditions: simple systems, manageable in rough field operations, a powerful nose-mounted cannon that hit exactly where the aircraft pointed, and a cockpit heater that kept pilots alive in sub-zero missions, luxuries Soviet-built fighters rarely offered. When temperatures plunged below 30 degrees C, Soviet mechanics developed their own ingenious maintenance solutions. They kept Airacobras flying under conditions that would have horrified American technicians, fabricating replacement parts in field workshops, improvising lubricants, and even using open fires beneath engine cowlings to thaw frozen oil before dawn sorties. In their hands, the much-maligned American fighter had found its true purpose, and in doing so, became one of the most effective weapons of the Eastern Front. When proper American spare parts were unavailable, Soviet mechanics improvised, installing local instruments and radios when original equipment failed, fabricating replacements from salvaged material, and devising new maintenance methods to keep the Airacobras operational, despite disrupted supply chains. Remarkably, the aircraft tolerated these field adaptations, continuing to perform reliably even after extensive modifications that bore little resemblance to factory standards. As the war dragged on, German intelligence reports on Soviet Airacobra units grew more detailed and more respectful. Luftwaffe pilots learned to treat the Soviet P-39s warily, especially at low altitude, where their performance remained competitive and their massive nose-mounted cannon could annihilate an opponent with a single shot. The psychological effect of facing an enemy armed with a gun that fired pound-and-a-half explosive shells was profound. German pilots accustomed to surviving multiple machine gun strikes now knew that a single 37mm hit could shear off a wing, explode an engine, or instantly kill a pilot. The Airacobra's success on the Eastern Front raised uncomfortable questions for Western air forces about how doctrine shaped perception. American and British commanders had written off the P-39 after it failed in their chosen missions, high-altitude escort and interception, concluding it was obsolete. Their judgment was perfectly valid within that framework. But the Soviets, operating under entirely different tactical and environmental conditions, evaluated the same aircraft through another lens and discovered it excelled in ground attack and low-altitude interdiction roles that Western doctrine had never even considered. The contrast revealed a deeper truth. No aircraft's worth exists in isolation. It depends on context. The P-39 truly was unsuited to 20,000-foot combat over Germany, but that limitation blinded Western planners to its potential elsewhere. On the Eastern Front, where fights unfolded below 10,000 feet, the Airacobra's flaws vanished, and its virtues, heavy firepower, sturdy construction, and stable low-altitude handling, became decisive. The machine, dismissed in the West as second-rate, became one of the most effective ground attack aircraft of the entire war when used according to doctrine that exploited its real strengths. German intelligence suffered a parallel blindness. Their early analyses of the Airacobra correctly noted its weaknesses in the kind of high-altitude duels for which Luftwaffe fighters were designed. From this, they comfortably concluded the aircraft posed little threat. What they failed to imagine was that the Soviets would use it differently, fighting low, hitting hard, and targeting logistics rather than dogfights. This inability to think beyond their own tactical assumptions reflected a recurring flaw in German assessments of Soviet operations. German analysts habitually judged Soviet equipment and strategy by German standards, failing to recognize that the Soviets fought a different kind of war, one often better adapted to the conditions of the Eastern Front. To German officers, Soviet use of fighters for close air support seemed wasteful, even crude. They missed the underlying logic. Soviet air doctrine emphasized direct assistance to ground forces over independent pursuit of air superiority. The locomotive destruction campaign was a perfect embodiment of that logic, identifying a critical weakness in German logistics, concentrating resources against it systematically, and accepting losses or limits elsewhere to achieve decisive strategic results. Soviet commanders understood they didn't need to dominate the skies if they could cripple the enemy's ability to fight. German tanks, no matter how advanced, were useless without fuel. German artillery, no matter how precise, was silent without shells. German infantry, no matter how brave, could not hold lines without food. Pushkin's career encapsulated this philosophy: technical mastery, tactical innovation, and the relentless pursuit of the enemy's weakest link until the entire machine of war began to seize up. His career illustrated the Soviet capacity to recognize genuine tactical innovation. Pushkin became the first pilot ever awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times, rising to command ever larger formations as his proven skill outweighed his humble origins. Despite the chaos and purges that had ravaged the Red Air Force before the war, the Soviet system still contained enough meritocratic pragmatism to reward results when they could not be ignored. The broader implications reached far beyond one aircraft or one pilot. The Airacobra's contrasting fortunes in Western and Soviet service revealed a deeper principle: no weapon system could be judged apart from how it was employed. Effectiveness was not an inherent quality. It depended on the mission, environment, and doctrine guiding its use. Western air forces learned this lesson only gradually. Their doctrines, built around strategic bombing and high-altitude escort, treated ground attack as a secondary task, something to be attempted only once air superiority was secure. It would take decades and wars in Korea and Vietnam to solidify the realization that air forces needed aircraft purpose-built for close support. The later American A-1 Sky Raider embodied that evolving understanding, showing that tactical realities demanded tailored machines, not universal ones. Germany, meanwhile, absorbed its own hard lessons. The devastation wrought by Airacobra attacks forced a rethinking of railway security in all future conflicts. Once locomotives proved vulnerable to air power, the premise became permanent. Trains could not operate safely without air cover, and no armor or camouflage could truly protect them from determined cannon-equipped attackers. In 1943 to 44, German railway officials tried everything, adding flak cars, disguising engines, building shelters, dispersing operations, but nothing could change the fundamental truth. A locomotive was a big, slow, visible target. Destroy one, and the entire supply chain behind it ground to a halt. The Airacobra's combat record on the Eastern Front remains oddly underappreciated in Western histories of the war. Anglophone narratives dwell on the air battles over Britain, Germany, and the Pacific, where American and British aircraft achieved clear dominance. The Eastern Front, despite its enormous scale and decisive influence, languished in comparative obscurity. Part of that neglect stemmed from Cold War barriers that kept Soviet archives sealed. Part came from a Western bias that viewed the Red Air Force's focus on ground attack as crude compared to the supposed sophistication of precision bombing campaigns. For decades, many Western writers dismissed Soviet success as a product of sheer numbers or German blunders rather than technical and tactical mastery. Yet the truth was more complex. Pilots like Aleksandr Pokryshkin proved that improvisation, discipline, and contextual understanding could match, and sometimes surpass, the innovation of their Western counterparts. They adapted imperfect tools to the realities they faced, and in doing so, turned an underrated American fighter into one of the war's most efficient instruments of strategic disruption. The Airacobra's locomotive hunting campaign was no accident of luck. It was the result of deliberate planning, sustained intelligence, and an acute awareness of how tactical action could yield strategic paralysis. Pokryshkin himself survived the war, a rare distinction for a frontline fighter pilot who flew over 600 combat missions and continued serving in the Soviet Air Force through the post-war decades, eventually rising to the rank of Marshal of Aviation. His memoir, published in Russian in the 1970s, offered vivid recollections of those missions and detailed analyses of Airacobra tactics. But it remained little known in the West until the post-Cold War era, when its translation finally revealed to broader audiences the story of a pilot, an aircraft, and a doctrine that quietly reshaped the air war on the Eastern Front.